Okay, good.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. Our speakers today are going to enlighten us and introduce us to some very exciting new scholarship on the Greek War of, the Greek War of, no, the Greek junta. We've had a number of 2021 lectures in the last couple of sessions. So let me introduce our two wonderful speakers who are co-editors of a very important new book that rethinks of the Greek military dictatorship. Let me see if I can. So Othon Anastasakis is Director of Southeast European Studies at Oxford University, Senior Research Fellow at St. Anthony's College, and Visiting Professor at the Prague School of Economics and Business. He is the author and editor of many books and articles, including more recently, Diaspora Engagement in Times of Severe Economic Crisis, Greece and Beyond, The Greek Military Dictatorship, Revising a Troubled Past with Katerina, The Legacy of Yugoslavia, Politics, Economy, and Society, Balkan Legacies of the Great War, The Past is Never Dead. His research interests include populism, illiberalism, and the far right, comparative European politics, migration and Greek diaspora, Balkan party politics, Southeast European geopolitics, Greek and Turkish foreign policies, political economies, and Russia and the Balkans. Katerina Lagos is a professor of history at California State University, Sacramento, and director of the Angelo K. Tsakopoulos Hellenic Studies Center. She has served as the vice president of the Modern Greek Studies Association and as social science book review editor for the Journal of Modern Greek Studies. Her research focuses on the Metaxas dictatorship, minorities, and the interwar period. And she also does a lot of work on diaspora, which I know of, especially in Sacramento. She recently published an edited volume with Othon, which we'll hear about, on the Greek military dictatorship, and is working on a book about the Metaxas dictatorship and Greek Jews from 1936 to 1941. The topic of their presentation will be the Greek military dictatorship, revisiting a troubled past, 1967 to 1974, which is the title of their very important new collection of essays. So we've decided that they will both speak a little bit about the volume and their perspectives on it. If we were having a live event, we would also have some books that we could buy on the side and have them signed. So in lieu of that, I encourage everyone to go to not too many local bookstores left, at least in Philadelphia, but to go online and order the book and read these wonderful essays. So thank you for coming to Philadelphia by Zoom.
Okay, so I think I'll begin. So we've spoken with Othon. So thank you. Good morning from California. Thank you, Kosti, and all the members of the Hellenic University Club for organizing and hosting this wonderful opportunity for Othon and I to speak about our book. So my purpose, I think, in the time that I have is to talk about the military, a little bit of the background, the origins from the military and the ideology for the regime, and then to trace where did the idea for the dictatorship where we can locate it in time. So the Greek military dictatorship, revisiting a troubled past, was an idea that arose at the end of a conference that I organized in Sacramento over a yet another sunny April weekend. 5 years, almost to the day, we are close to the 21st, in Sacramento. So it was in 2017. And listening to the presentations during the conference, Othon and I noticed two things. First, that 50 years after the colonel's coup, many aspects of the dictatorship remained understudied, and that there was space for more research on this contested period in Greece's recent Cold War history. Second, despite the 50-year distance, some legacies of the regime are still with us today. We therefore made the decision to build on this conference by inviting some of our paper presenters to contribute to a volume and then solicit some additional contribution aiming at an innovative and up-to-date addition to the literature on the military dictatorship. The product of these contributions are in the book that we have published, as you can see. Typically in Greek historiography, the military dictatorship of 1967 to 74 is characterized as an aberration in Greek politics or an unwanted regime forced on the Greek population, typically assumed as being by the United States. Yet military dictatorships are anything but an aberration in Greek political life. Beginning in 1843 and up until World War II, the Greek military, specifically the army, intervened in Greek political affairs in conjunction with politicians to help end stalemates and usher in political change. The Woudi Revolt of 1909 marks a watershed moment in Greek military history because it laid the groundwork for a more activist military and their direct involvement in governing Greece. Instead of revolting and ushering new civilian politicians to power, such as Eleftherios Venizelos in 1909, following the Woudi coup, military leaders now assume political power themselves. This is reflected in the three interwar military dictatorships of Colonel Nikolaos Plastides from 1922 to 24, General Theodoros Pangalos from 1925 to 26, and then again General Ioannis Metaxas of 1936 to 41. Following the Greek Civil War, military activism had reached such a heightened level that there were 4 planned coups d'etats, not carried out, but planned, between 1950 and 1967, 1951, 55, 61, and 63. Thus, the 20th century reflected a growing pattern of military involvement in political affairs in which the junta dictatorship can be understood. The military considered its self-ascribed mission to defend the interests of the nation. The military embodied and symbolized the Greek nation and would intervene in political affairs in order to defend Greek national interests. For the 20th century, there are 2 other factors that characterize the military. First is the anti-communist rhetoric. It also served as a justification for the military's intervention in politics. Secondly, and according to late Andre Gerolimatos in his chapter, the armed forces were honeycombed with secret leagues and associations that were linked to political patrons. Following the Greek Civil War, the Greek military would be influenced by the new Cold War reality and American involvement in Greek affairs. Andre Gerolimatos argues that the composition of the military would emerge far more politically homogeneous and reflect a more strident anti-communist and pro-royalist position than in the past. The military had been purged during the Civil War and no longer reflected the pre-war Venizelist and anti-Venizelist factions. American involvement in Greek affairs during the Civil War and post-war period was also significant as it resulted in a restructuring of the Greek military, so that it became a semi-autonomous arm of the government. This prevented Greek elected officials from intervening in the military's administration and activities. We see that with George Papandreou and Konstantinos Karamanlis. Finally, the Greek military was given additional options for political intervention through 2 NATO-devised plans that were developed in the post-war period. Plan Pericles, which was meant to suppress internal threats, but applied to the 1961 elections to guarantee a conservative political outcome. And then Plan Prometheus, a countermeasure designed to prevent a communist invasion from the north, but used to bring the colonels to power in 1967. In terms of ideology, the colonels adopted nationalist and anti-communist rhetoric that can be linked back to 2 interwar dictatorships, that of Pangalos and Metaxas. The clearest connection between the junta dictatorship and the pre-junta period can be seen in the colonels' advocacy of anti-communism as a pillar of their ideology. Anti-communism was part of the political discourse of the 1920s and figured prominently in the interwar dictatorships. In the post-war period, a strong anti-communist ideology was developed among the Army Officer Corps and was even incorporated in the oath of allegiance that the officers swore to King Constantine. Nationalist ideological rhetoric was characteristic of the junta dictatorship, and we could see that linked to the Metaxas dictatorship, since half the lead members of the dictatorship graduated from the military academy in 1939 and 1940, and therefore would have been imbued with Metaxas propaganda. 2 of the most prominent slogans for the junta dictatorship were Greece of the Christian Greeks, Elas Elino Christianon, and Fatherland Religion Family, Patris Thriskie Ikogenia. And they were reminiscent of the Metaxas period. Interestingly, these two slogans were not unique or novel to the Metaxas dictatorship, but actually stem from pre-existing nationalist ideas from the late 19th century. Patris Thriskie Ikogenia was a slogan that emerged in the 1880s. For the junta leaders, their so-called ideological vision would therefore come to rely on these same pre-existing nationalist and anti-communism, but used to save, quote unquote, the sick patient of Greece that was on the operating table. The immediate origins, and we'll go now to how the actual coup began, can be located in the events of 1965. Tensions between King Constantine and Papandreou reached a boiling point when George Papandreou asked Constantine to assume the portfolio of the Ministry of Defense, replacing Petros Garoufalias. Constantine refused Papandreou's request on the grounds that this appointment would create a conflict of interest. Papandreou's son, Andreas, was under investigation for his involvement in a left-wing clandestine organization named Officers Save the Fatherland, Ideals, Democracy, Meritocracy, Aspida, as we know, is shield in Greek. Andreas was accused of being the leader and inspiration behind the Aspida group, whose primary aim was to take Greece out of NATO and to set up a Nasser-style populist socialist state. In response to King Constantine's rejection, Papandreou submitted his resignation. For several weeks following Papandreou's resignation in July, riots and demonstrations plagued the country. These protests, together with an uptick in worker and farmer strikes, gave conservatives the impression of a general breakdown of order. These July events, in Greek Iuliana, prompted a heightened sense of fear in the palace, the military, and members of the extreme right. King Constantine actively sought to lure the Center Union deputies away from their party, Apostates, and help form a government with the ERE. A government was formed under the leadership of Stefanos Stephanopoulos and will last until December 1966, when the head of the ERE, Panagiotis Kanelopoulos, withdrew his support from the government. A new caretaker government was put in place under the leadership of banker Ioannis Paraskevopoulos, and new elections were scheduled for May 1967. This would be the fourth caretaker government since July 1965 and reflected a regression to the political instability of the interwar years. With politicians unable to sort out their differences, various military groups began discussing action to bring the chaos to an end. Rumors of coups began to circulate widely. Andres Papandreou himself stated in an article on March 9th that, quote, forces within Greece were plotting to rig elections scheduled for May 28th or to prevent them from being held by imposing a dictatorship planned by a junta whose tentacles spread from the palace to foreign intelligence services, the extreme right, and the economic oligarchy. George Papandreou expressed similar concerns to American Ambassador Phillips Talbot on March 17th, perhaps with the unspoken hope that American officials might intervene. While both Andreas and George Papandreou referenced the junta as a group of army generals and politicians who were supported by King Constantine, another mid-level group of army officers were also secretly planning their next steps. These were 30 to 40 middle grade military officers who worked quietly over a period of time to perfect a plan which paralleled that of the Greek General Staff's long-standing plan to prevent a communist takeover. These officers were members of the EENA and titled themselves the Revolutionary Council, and it follows in the tradition of Plastida's Revolutionary Committee. This Revolutionary Council was founded in 1963, and its members have become progressively more disillusioned with the deteriorating political situation and the inability of the politicians to solve Greece's problems. In addition, they harbored resentment against Papandreou because the military was, quote, left out of big pay increases to the police, the judiciary, and the huge constituency of teachers, end quote. To add insult to injury, many of the EENA were transferred from Athens to the provinces in 1964 and would remain there for the duration of Papandreou's tenure in office. Ironically, though, Several of the EENA members were assigned to the same provincial posts and continued to plot their next steps without any interference. The lead member of the Revolutionary Council was Colonel George Papadopoulos, who had figured prominently in the 1961 Plan Pericles, had direct connection with the United States military, and was a member of KIP, which was actually helped formed by the United States. Papadopoulos, along with Nikolaos Makarezos and Stylianos Patakos, were brought back into Athens in late 1965 by General Gregory Spandidakis, who was the head of the general staff under the short-lived Stephanopoulos government. Papadopoulos took advantage of his reassignment and gained access to the confidential negotiations regarding the military intervention by his superiors. In addition, all of Papadopoulos' co-conspirators were transferred to key positions in the general staff, which allowed them to control the standards of military administration. Spandidakis tasked Papadopoulos to revise the NATO-approved Plan Prometheus, designed to prevent a communist overthrow of the government. By December 1966, Papadopoulos and other members of the Revolutionary Council met at the home of Lieutenant Colonel Ioannis Ladas. Here, they discussed the political situation and toyed with the idea of establishing a dictatorship. When Parliament was dissolved on April 15, 1967, the colonels decided to take action. The inner executive circle of the National Council, known as the Revolutionary Group, met at Patakos' house in the Athenian suburb of Anopatisia on Tuesday, April 18th, to finalize their plan. It is at this point that Papadopoulos becomes a formal leader of the colonels, and the date for the coup was scheduled for the night of April 21st, 1967. So with this and George Papandreou's impending speech in Thessaloniki, they used him as a justification for them to launch the coup. On that evening at 2 o'clock in the morning, tanks rolled out, communications were cut, people were taken by surprise, not that a coup was going to happen, but who was behind this specific coup? This was a surprise that took everyone. So with this is the idea, the background of the junta. I'm going to turn the floor over to Othon, who will talk about many aspects of rupture and continuity that we use within our volume. And also I had the interesting situation, we could talk about it later, of meeting Patakos at his house and some of his responses to interviews. So with that, I'll turn the floor to Othon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And may I first thank Kostis for organizing this and giving us the opportunity to present our book on the 55th anniversary of the imposition of the military coup. Katerina gave a very good kind of background to how all this happened. I'm also particularly pleased that Athanasios is also joining because he's written his the chapter on the junta and the church, and he's also a colleague and fellow on diaspora matters as well that I've been working on for the last 3 years. Anyway, just to say that with Katerina, we've got this commonality apart from a very close friendship of both of us having worked on our PhDs on dictatorships. I did a comparison between Metaxas and the military junta. Katerina did Metaxas in particular. So we had that big common point, and it was very natural for us to decide to do this edited volume together after she organized this conference in Sacramento so successfully. Now let me speak a little bit about then the junta, because this book, and we're indebted to all these contributors, but also a good opportunity for us with Katerina to put our research there as well. We looked at various aspects of it, ranging from nature of the regime, ideology, government policies, cultural traits, links with the religion, with diaspora, and foreign politics, external relations. And we specifically looked at the issues of continuities and ruptures. This is a way of understanding how exceptional this regime was in terms of the continuum of Greece's natural history. And starting with the notion of rupture with the past, undoubtedly, on the morning of the 21st of April, the time stopped for Greece with the establishment of a military regime which was very specifically confined within time. It lasted 7 years, 3 months, and 3 days until the 24th of July, when it totally and abruptly collapsed. So this is a period with historical boundaries, but how about the ruptures and continuities with the past? Broadly speaking, a rupture with the past is a multifaceted issue, and it is interpreted differently by those who bring about this rupture, differently by those who experience the rupture, and differently by the future generations that remember it. I'm going to talk about all these three aspects. Now, in our book, we see rupture in three ways. First of all, as a human experience of how people felt that their normality was disrupted by this kind of military regime. Then it's about the ideology of the colonels as a rupture, and then government choices which are also, and policies which are also a rupture with the past. Now, in terms of the human experience, that abrupt imposition of a completely different type of regime, it must have felt obviously as being some kind of totally and radically new, unexpected, and all of a sudden the country was ruled by military rulers with no civilian background in how to run a country, from multi-party politics, and indeed from the polemical discourses and differences that Katerina was talking about. The country goes into a state of party non-existence and the annulment of parliamentarism. From the societal perspective as well, we shouldn't forget that the 1960s was a time of a social spring in terms of struggles and demonstrations and marches and student movements, a polyphony of movements, and that drops into a social silence with the junta, which is followed by oppression of any kind of alternative expression. Indeed, from a cultural pluralism as well, in literature, in poetry, in cinema, the country goes into a censorship, manipulation of Greek culture by people who have actually very little connection with it, and what we saw subsequently as a promotion of a very peculiar, tasteless, populist subculture marked by odd parades in stadiums, pompous festivities on national holidays, or kitsch religious events. Now, in the field of ideological rupture, Katerina has spoken in her chapter about this. The protagonists of the dictatorship, they actually adopted a conscious rupture with the past, with the immediate past, calling their coup an ethno-salvation revolution, the ethnosoterios of Anastasakis, to save, according to their own rhetoric, the country from anarcho-communism. And as governors as well, the colonels chose to break with democracy, abolishing the constitution, party politics, annulling the elections that were planned for May 1967, and then subsequently creating further rifts with other institutions as well, the palace, the top officials within their own army, the leadership of the church, with the replacement of Archbishop Chrysostomos by the faithful Hieronymus. Athanasius can speak more to that, given that they've written this excellent chapter on how church hierarchy was actually captured by the military state. And that was obviously a rupture with the past, and a double rupture indeed, because then there was, with the Ioannidis coup, there was a second rupture in church with another archbishop being imposed. In the field of education, which I have worked in this book, there was similarly another rupture, given the fact that right before the military coup, there was a very progressive reform that had been adopted by Georgios Papandreou, and that actually was one of the first moves from the military regime, was the cancellation of this reform, and going back to previous kind of recipes of regressive and repressive practices. The youth in particular was a sector that suffered from the military regime, but as we know, it also became its nemesis in that it brought about the start of the fall of the regime. But in this particular field, also the military regime went up to a certain point with this kind of regressive and repressive practices, because they also wanted to present a pseudo technocratic face after a certain point, given that it was unsustainable the way that it had their reactionary policies from the beginning. But the repressive nature of the regime was totally incompatible with any attempt to modernize the field anyway. There was also a rift, a rupture with diaspora. That's another chapter in our book, which is written by Alex Kitroev, where he says that at the beginning, there was a kind of a smooth relationship between Iakovos and the Greek Americans, especially at the point when they organized together a very big congress in 1968 in Athens, but eventually relations ruptured between these two, given that the junta perceived the diaspora as the extension of the Greeks, and the way they patronized Greeks and repressed them, they wanted to do the same with diaspora as well. Obviously, that met with resistance coming from Iakovos in the United States. But the biggest rupture is the one that took place in Cyprus. This is another chapter by Spiros Sakas in our book, where the colonels at the beginning tried to continue the policy of enosis from the outset, yet behind closed doors, they pursued the solution based on partition. That's the one that we saw very clearly by the invisible dictator Ioannidis when he came into confrontation with Makarios and organized the coup, which led to the division of Cyprus and the invasion of Turkey. What about the aspects of continuity? The junta did not, there is this perception that it wasn't a complete rupture with the past. There was that kind of, as Katerina mentioned before, the ground was prepared. Even the coup was prepared by various actors. It's just that the colonels managed to do this much better than all the others. And democratic politics as well, they were before, gripped by political strife, apostasy between 1965 and 67, a very, very turbulent period in Greek history. At the same time, and Katerina argues in her chapter as well, the colonels didn't have to invent the wheel. They had the repressive methods that they brought back from the interwar period, the Metaxas period, and obviously the post-war, post-civil war conflict period. But apart from those ideological and practical affinities with the past, there were also conscious governmental policies that opted for continuity. That is a chapter that we have in the book by Kakridis. He writes specifically about economic policy and how in the field of banking, trade, the financial and commercial sectors, the junta actually continued with the policy that was practiced before. This, mind you here, unlike other Latin American comparable examples, when dictators there intervened in politics because there was an economic crisis and they adopted their own neoliberal policy. Chile is actually a very characteristic example. In the Greek case, the economy was actually doing very, very well. So they continued with this very well in terms of growth, so they continued with this policy of high growth and also a policy of investments as well. They kind of presented themselves as being very much in favor of investments. We have a very interesting chapter by Kalogerakos there, who demonstrates that they supported investment, foreign investment, but that was more of a window dressing at the end of the day, because they continued that big clientelistic role of the state. They continued that, same old pathology. And in the end, obviously, that economic policy and the way that foreign investment was, adopted, it did lead to the economic crisis that we know of 1973-74. And last but not least, there is that continuity in external relations. And we're not talking just about the United States, because there we have a chapter as well by Miller, who wrote about how the United States, they had to consider geostrategic interests. They didn't necessarily they were not necessarily involved in the actual imposition of the coup, but once that happened, they decided that they just had to work with it for the sake of geopolitics and other considerations. But it's much more interesting in terms of how this happened with Western European governments, because one would have expected that these are liberal democracies there, much more sensitive, the populations were sensitive also to this kind of illiberalism and authoritarianism in Greece. Yet, you know, Britain, even under Labour government, this is a chapter that we've got with Nafpliotis, who writes about how the Brits and the governments continued their policy as usual. But another chapter we have on West Germany by Pelt, who writes about how the Germans followed a policy of non-intervention. That term is actually very relevant today in the way that we approach the, you know, here in Greece, the war in Ukraine and the invasion, that non-intervention, which can always be as negative because they were not willing, the Germans back then, to sacrifice very good deals, especially in the field of military or trade. So with those aspects of continuity, we do realize that it wasn't a total rupture in the past, because at the end of the day, the real rupture that happened was the one in 1974. It was actually the fall of the dictatorship. It was when democracy was established firmly in the country. Of course, you know, we've got looking and thinking of the legacy and how we remember that period, those of us who lived through it, but also the subsequent generations. It is actually a bittersweet memory, because on the one hand, there is a consolidation of Greek democracy, and on the other hand, there is the defeat in Cyprus. There is the real end of the few remaining who had in their heads the great idea, the Megali idea, the wider Hellenism, that in 1974 was totally and completely ruptured with the past. But having said that, there are also legacies from the junta that went, you know, a long time after that, thinking of how the Polytechnic is celebrated every year, with its ups and downs, the kind of default natural anti-Americanism that you know, has been particularly pronounced in the Greek public opinion. Certainly among Western Europe, Greece was for many, many years the most anti-American society. But even, you know, later with the crisis and the Golden Dawn, as a reminder of, you know, how authoritarianism and criminal organizations can remind you of a past. But having said that, it is a democracy that did survive even after the very deep crisis that hurt the country. Let me finish by saying that this is actually, despite some criticism that has been leveled to the role of Metapolitevsi and how much that brought and what kind of democracy, at the end of the day, it is a democratic regime. And if one considers today what's happening in other countries, even in the European Union, you know, like in Hungary or in Poland, or other countries like in Serbia or our neighbor Turkey and beyond, how illiberalism and those autocrats are actually gaining ground, I think this is really something that we need to treasure and always remember, that what happens as a democracy today is that gift from the fall of the junta in 1974 and the way that things progressed since then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both of your wonderful presentations. And Athanasios, do you want to say something now? Did you want to add something from your article since you're here, or anybody else? We didn't formally announce you, but it'd be great if you wanted to say something now or later. Yeah.
No problem. Just a few words, since we have already started talking about the content, and I feel first thing to say is that I'm very thankful to the two editors who have been for a long time teachers to me. I appreciate their work, and now they're friends and colleagues. And as a younger scientist, I feel the honor and I'm grateful. I believe this is a unique and very very good, very useful book to read to readdress all these issues, because today in Greece we have many admirers of that past, many people who think that we say η junta έκανε έργα, junta has executed many works, many public works, and that means that many people are grateful for this, but they ignore the cost of these works, but also the cost in political rights. So it's always good to remember the things, especially these things, especially in the economic sector, that some other people claim that there was an economic miracle from the junta. But the chapter that I have co-authored with Katerina Lagos Othon, who is not here today, is about a very sensitive topic that has been coming around all the time. It's about the church. The relationship between the church and the state in Greece was always a complicated thing and a matter of controversy. But in this case, we find that the junta follows the pattern that politicians have been following since the foundation of modern Greece. And this is how to control the church, because the church is popular. It has a very big flock. Most of the Greeks, one way or another, are Christian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, even if they don't go very frequently to the church, but they have this identity, and identity matters. And we see that from the very first month of the coup, the junta orchestrated another coup within the church, and that is they dethroned, they removed, they ousted from office Archbishop Chrysostomos II, who was a figure with human rights. Well known for his support of human rights, but he was old, so they found a way to oust him because of age limits that, of course, they voted a posteriori, and they suspended also the function of the Holy Synod of Greece, and they substituted it with an extraordinary small council of 8 bishops, who were, of course, controlled by them. They were selected by them. These bishops in the next phase, they selected, they were assigned to propose 3 names for the next archbishop, and then the government, the Minister for Education, with under the auspices of the colonialist government, they selected Hieronymus, who was not a metropolitan, a bishop. He was an archimandritis. He was lowering the rank, that is what I mean. But he was favored because he was a member of the political system. He was the chief priest of the palace at the moment, but also he was a very well-respected professor of canon law at the theology school of Aristotle University. He was indeed a respected member of the clergy, and maybe under different circumstances, maybe his potential might have been productive. I don't know, but in the historical context that he decided to act, it was counterproductive, and his tenure was stigmatized by disrespect for canonical order. So this is going to be very small, just 2 comments, and then I will give you back the floor. He disrupted relations with the ecumenical patriarchate because he wanted to take full control. Greece, although it's a nation state, we know the map. It has 5 different statuses of church authorities. So especially when it comes to the new lands, the Neas Chores of Epirus, Macedonia, and Thrace, this belongs spiritually to the ecumenical patriarchate. So he wanted to take full control, making, in a sense, a national church. Simultaneously, he wanted to change the balance of power within the structure of the church by getting rid of bishops who were not so keen to the regime and substitute them with others. Of course, disrupting again the canonical order, making illegal things, so to speak. At some point, this was this method that he was following was rejected by the Council of State. There were some problems, and then he had also to resign. And his successor at the very late, the last year of the junta period, Seraphim, he was diplomatically more flexible, and that's why he remained in his office also afterwards. But the thing is, During Hieronymus, the church was severely hurt, and that had also very big consequences for the next phase. So this is for now, and once again, thank you for this wonderful meeting today.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's open it to questions, or yeah, thank you everybody. This is just wonderful. This is just so incredible. I mean, I think this is definitely a reconsideration. As you said, there are so many the memories and the legacies and the kind of stereotypical responses have been set for so many years. You hear them over and over again. You know, it's whether it's from an anti-Americanism, or whether it's Iakovos's role in it and the CIA. I mean, which are of course present, but those main narratives have disguised all of the other much more interesting genealogical and also causal ruptures that you guys have, or the contributors and you guys have documented. So let me open it up to the members of the university.
I have a question and a comment, if nobody else is okay. So thank you so much. This is quite amazing and a wealth of information. This has been a very interesting era indeed, and I grew up in Greece. I was there when all of this happening. I'm not old enough to remember the beginning of the junta, but old enough to have lived the aftermath of a junta. And interestingly, I want to kind of add to the discussion and raise a question about another aspect of this era. Actually, our daughter did a research paper when she was in her IB program in high school on the relationship between junta and the strong anti-Americanism feeling that was developed in Greece. And actually, I was very surprised that she got a lot of primary resources kind of that support that strongly. Definitely from my own experience, certainly there was a very strong anti-Americanism feeling in Greece after the junta, which it turns out that it had a long-lasting effect. So basically, even the day of the Polytechnio Day, right, when the students were, there was the uprising against junta. There were signs all over that were anti-American signs, and on the belief, obviously, that the intervention, right, the support by the U.S. was, people were convinced of it. So I don't know exactly how much evidence there is, but people were convinced that this, the Americans, supported this junta, and the longer effects actually were in the narrative, in the political life. Like a strong part of the Andreas Papandreou party, when he got into power and became super popular and governed Greece like for more than 8 years. The narrative was anti-American, right? It was he gained the popularity building on the feeling of anti-Americanism. So I am wondering if you looked into that at all, and the kind of what are the data, what extent of the American intervention, and how the U.S. supported junta, and like anything around that, because clearly the perceived feeling in Greece was that the U.S. was very responsible for this, and for me the impact was huge, because over decades, Greece did not want to be in a very good relationship with the U.S.
Do you want me to take a little bit of this, Othon, or do you want to? Okay, so there is a general misconception that somehow the United States wanted to foster this dictatorship. And we see it clearly in the communication. They didn't want to see an extra parliamentary solution, yet they did not want to see George Papandreou. So we always have these communications, no Papandreou, no external solution. And they had an almost irrational fear and hatred of George Papandreou, and especially Andres. They saw George was getting old. They knew that he didn't have a long time to go. So it was not that they fostered, and their whole thing was, how do we deal with these people? And Talbot was like, we need to give a very starchy response, like we don't really support. So it's almost this two narrative that they were not in favor. We see this in the documents. I mean, it's kind of misperceived as such, that the United States wanted a dictatorship. No, they didn't. And they were kind of surprised at how it came about. It was these.
What is the evidence for that? Can you talk more about the evidence?
We've got diplomatic correspondences between what's going on in the State Department, what's going on in the CIA. We're using the presidential archives as well. So from all of this information, we have a consistent pattern. I'm almost sad that Jim Miller, he's the one who wrote on the chapter on the United States and the junta. And he also concludes he was in charge of the foreign relations of the United States, the declassified documents. And he argues the same exact thing. It's like, we see it in all the documentation that they were not. Whether you had a one-off person saying something is another thing. I mean, even if you look at Ioannidis and his invasion of Cyprus, go to Papagelas's new book. And it's like, did we really have clear authority by the United States? Did he kind of misinterpret it? Did he take signals in a positive direction? I don't know.
Can I add something here? Katerina, obviously, as a historian, is much more familiar with those particular nuances as to how much they were informed, whether they were supportive, and also how they continued. We know for sure that they did create a functional relationship with the military regime because they didn't want to spoil the very delicate geopolitical balance. One thing about Greece's anti-Americanism, and I can speak more from my kind of discipline in the politics and the international relations, the anti-Americanism in Greece goes before the military regime. It goes back to the civil war of Greece, a country which is very bitterly divided between East and West, meaning the communism and the capitalism, but at the same time, how the connection between CIA and the military officers that were bred and they developed themselves during the hard years of the Civil War and beyond, that is a very important part of the story of how the United States contributed to those military officers believing themselves to be able to be governors when circumstances, required them to do so. And also how the United States made, informal dealings with the palace. These are all, memories that are there even before the military regime. The fact that the United States developed a working relationship with the military junta is something which also didn't go down well afterwards. I mean, maybe things are better now in terms of how we see our transactionalism with the United States, in the sense that I believe that there is consensus across the board that you need to have a certain transactional relationship with the US. It kind of helps you more than hurts you now, given the new geopolitical circumstances. But at the same time, that ideology is very much ingrained into the Greek psyche. I mean, this is the only country that saw people going actually outside the American embassy to cry out against the war in Russia. I mean, what is the connection there? Nothing. It's just that there is that kind of default position that you need to say that there is always an American finger before, Americanos dactylos. I mean, how the United States, I've heard the argument now that they're also benefiting from what's happening in Ukraine. So there's always that kind of automatic reaction that the US somehow is involved whenever something, is negative, or it's kind of stirring the geopolitical balance.
Thank you for saying that. And actually, while I was listening to Katerina, I opened my daughter's report to find the evidence that she had found. It was exactly the evidence about CIA. So, how did we know that there was support by US? And it was exactly what you said, right? Because it was, I think there is evidence that the American CIA funded the Greek CIA during that time. But that is exactly why I was wondering, and I don't know how things can change, or, like how the history evolves, but it is what you're saying now is about what is happening and how the Communist Party continues with this kind of anti-American ideology. For me, this is even kind of, like even the tail of this super long effect, right? And consequence that particular, like the junta and the connection between junta and the US has had on Greek political life. Because at some point it affected not only the Communist Party or communists in Greece, but the entire society, because not everybody is a communist in Greece, but everybody, or a big part, like a huge majority of Greek citizens are against or were against the junta. Do you see what I mean? That's what I mean by that long-lasting effect, right? Because it was, yes, it is true that all this anti-Americanism, it is part of a core part of the communist ideology, but I don't know how to say that in how do you say sigiria in English? I'm not sure, but this kind of timing, right? this association, because everybody is against the junta, not only the communists, right? And this association between the junta and the, like the way it was supported by the US. And this, I mean, I'm mentioning that because I was surprised by the length of the impact of this moment in time and this connection of the US with the junta. And we're talking about now, like, 2022, and there are still kind of, there's a little bit of an aftermath. I was like, historically, to be quite honest, I was very surprised because, this sentiment kind of got created and somehow it lingered for decades, even after we have forgotten about the junta, right? Like the sentiment historically, it was lingering. I find this historically very, very, very interesting. I don't know. Do you think it will go away? Has it started going away? I don't know historically and in other instances of juntas in other countries how these sentiments might change historically.
Let me take, you have actually a two-part comment here. And let me take the last one first, because when you talk about this rapprochement with the United States, you see it with the economic crisis. Because Obama comes to Greece and then you have this reawakening. Katerina Lagos of Kathimerini, she's really emphasized that it became a turning point, that Obama would go to Merkel and say, listen, this is ridiculous. We support you. And on his tour, it was almost symbolic. The final tour of his presidency, he's going to come to Greece. So it's very important. Now, to go back to anti-Americanism, I wouldn't say that with the coup itself, that is the genesis of anti-Americanism. I think that there was already a foundation in place beforehand. And if you look at George Papandreou, when he talks about the Cyprus affair, he talks about the foreign interference men, right? It's the United States, but he kind of leaves off the fact that Johnson was trying to get Papandreou and Ioannou to sit down and for them to hash things out. So when things didn't kind of work out that way, it was much easier to blame Johnson. It's always the United States. It was always the Dean Acheson plan that was there. So also the fact the United States was training all these officers. Papadopoulos was in the United States. They learned sophisticated CIA torture techniques in the United States and then brought them back to Greece to then use on the Greek people. So this link between the CIA, you've got this new keep and these other secret societies and their involvement. It's kind of semi-autonomous away from these elected officials. Laid a foundation of, the United States is the eminent grise, the puppet master behind the scenes. So therefore, when it happens, it had to be at the bequest of the United States. And the final piece of information to add to this is when the coup happens, King Constantine immediately, all the lines are cut. Tanagra's cut up north. People are intercepting his messages. Like, we've got to stop this revolution from happening. He tries to get contact with the American ambassador and say, I need some assistance. So what is can you come? You have to stop this coup from happening. The United States did not. What they did offer Constantine was a helicopter to get himself and his family out of the country. But Constantine said, no, I need to stay. I need to negotiate with these people and try to get them to accept a return to constitutional rule. Like, let's talk about a constitution. Let's talk about a return to democracy. This is your historic mission to come back. So let's talk about that. So yeah, so I'll just get back to, there was a foundation of anti-American sentiment that was latent, that was growing in the post-war period, that was exacerbated with the junta, and it became a characteristic link.
And
Thank you. Somebody wants to
Yeah,
talk?
please jump in if you have a question. Just jump in.
He's muted. Somebody wants.
Yeah, you need to unmute. Can you hear me, please? Okay, thank you. I would like to add, my name is Alexandros Kokinidis, and I am a psychiatrist, but I was working for the Greek Navy. I'm a retired admiral, so I have lived through all these, developments, in the Greek history. And I just like to add, 2 or 3 points. First of all, for the involvement, and I think very much, Katerina, about the involvement of King Constantine, in all this situation, it is something that it was his inexperience. If he was his father, or at least King George, who has survived 3 to 6, I believe, coups, military coups in Middle East during the war, and he was able to control, all these upheavals, we will not have the junta, definitely. The second one about the anti-Americanism. The anti-Americanism started during the Civil War as very, that's because the involvement of the American factor, because the British, they couldn't help more, and the overthrow of the communists, that they were getting, trying to get, Greece into the Soviet domain. It is something that the left has never forget, and they were keeping saying about that, against that. And also keep in mind that this it is also an anti-royalism, that you have in the left, which is very strong and is going back to the times of Venizelos and King Constantine, in the first. And still, this is a mixture that is not so easily, so you cannot explain that, by all these things. And also, and the rest, and all those people that they were working, trained in the CIA, it was a big plan made by NATO, the so-called the Fleece, which was what you have to do, to prepare a country if the communism will get the control of that, and all this Prometheus plan and Pericles plan was parts of that big Fleece, which was applied not only in Greece, in Italy and other places, something like that. And that's another issue. And I think that, okay, I think I have talked enough. Thank you very much.
Donny, yeah, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation today. I was actually intrigued by a reference that you made to the chapter that Kitroev wrote about the connection of diaspora and Greece. And I said, okay, I needed to get Papachelas's book. Now I needed to get this book, but I have first to go through all the spectacular books that they were published about the 21 revolution. And I don't know, retirement doesn't come too early, It's so anyway, beyond this comment, I was actually curious about this connection
because you made a comment that the diaspora was not possible to fully control, as they could actually control the local population. And that game is very interesting because I was thinking that we may see this played in the future because, you know, with a return of authoritarianism, situations where funny things are happening in a place, the diaspora can actually play a role. I was thinking, you know, what do the Russians of the in the US are thinking, doing, what role do they play in today's situation? And of course, maybe we can call Kitroev to talk to us about this more, but I wanted to hear from you, what do you see there? What are the dynamics? I mean, sometimes, at least myself, we were sort of aware of the games with the Greek American Church, but at least for me, that I was born in Greece, I don't have a good idea as to what was the role of the rest of the diaspora in that period of time. And I would be wondering if you had something to offer to us on that subject.
Yeah, I can give you some clues. Although I am not a historian of diaspora, my work on diaspora is more about the much more contemporary aspects of it, and especially how it evolved during the years of crisis with what happened with new immigration and brain drain. But I will borrow some things from Kitroev and try to make some comparisons with what we see today. During those times, diaspora was obviously, you know, very numerous outside Greek borders, but it wasn't involved so much as diaspora in the politics of the country, and it wasn't indeed the habit in other countries either. The right of diaspora to vote, to be involved politically in the countries, was something that developed in the constitutions and also through transnational institutions much later, from the 1980s and 90s onwards, and became a pattern of how diasporas engage with their homeland. From Alex's chapter, how I perceive is that we've got more of a power game between a very powerful Archbishop Iakovos in the United States and how he relates to a very powerful, obviously, junta in the Greek homeland. And what Alex says is that at the beginning there was this attempt for the two to work smoothly. But when there was really a patronizing attitude from the military regime to behave with diasporans abroad, this is where he actually met with the obstacle of Iakovos, who, as we all know, was and is still, I mean, you know, his legacy still very powerful in the United States. So it's more about power politics back then. And obviously the role of diasporas back then was about lobbying and about relations with the American administration as well. Things are different now. I mean, it's very pertinent that you mention countries like Russia or other countries in need, when, you know, they're using the diasporas in order to consolidate their authority at home. I mean, we have seen that, for instance, in the case of Turkey, very explicitly, how Erdogan has been using, you know, his diasporans in Europe, for instance, to get him elected, because now there is the power of the vote. And it's a good thing that that was also institutionalized recently, very late, in my opinion, in the Greek case as well, and under very, very strict conditions. But those who are abroad, they just need to be politically involved. Back then, they were not. There were different kinds of links. It was a very, very different situation back then. So that's my kind of, you know, short answer to your question.
Thank you.
In the meantime, let's say goodbye to Katerina because she has to go catch a flight back. But we can continue a little bit longer and talk to Othon. Thank you, Katerina. Have a safe flight. Bye.
And you're in safe hands with Othon and Athanasios. Thank you so much, Kostis. Thank you to everyone at the Hellenic University Club. Okay.
Bye, Katerina.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, I think that I'd just add from my perspective, I think the sadness of the diaspora connection is that I think you have this, you know, I mean, keep forgetting that during World War II, the diaspora had almost no connection back to family and had no sense of what's happening to their villages, to their, and then all of a sudden they land in this completely new political landscape where they are, you know, they go back home and they're the enemy without really having experienced that transition in the Greek, you know, in the Greek Civil War. So I'm sure you guys have insights on how then that was mobilized, particularly in the 50s, because I do feel a sense that through whatever channel the diaspora, beyond even beyond the Iakovos, felt a little bit, or some aspects of the diaspora either were sort of highlighted the narrative of progress and development that they were experiencing when they would go back to their villages during the junta, and somehow that became one of their excuse mechanisms of, you know, things are finally running in order, like in the United States, right? And anyway, so Thanasi, you have a comment? I'll be quiet.
I also want to point out that there is a question in the chat. I don't know if anybody saw that.
I think possibly Thanasis would like to say something on the topic of diaspora, possibly.
Yeah, please, Thanasi. You
Yes.
and then we'll move on to Tina's question.
Thank you very much. I want to take on from Othon's comment that the diaspora was not very much engaged with the Greek politics, in the sense that they were not engaged in the contemporary politics of the era in a partisan style. But from my research in the archives, I see that they have a very vague, but still it's like en bloc, but vague engagement, ideological. I mean, you are either a right-wing politically affiliated, or you are pro-communist. But it's very difficult to be pro-communist in the United States. And of course, Iakovos also was very he was very patriotic. He was coming from Imbros. He had this national feeling, and he was encouraging people. His example, it was a similar thing of fighting for the Western values. After all, he was elected with the support of Karamanlis, and it was like an agreement between the Greek and the American government to have someone who would help the communication of the two. Something that it is very important now when we talk about the junta, and given that I have also been studying some letters very recently about the Macedonian issue in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, is that they wouldn't care, the Greek Americans, they wouldn't care that much if the regime in Greece is undemocratic, as long as it's not communist, as long as the fear of communism is fading away. So they would compromise, and they would postpone maybe reactions or something for the future. But the most important thing was to be anti-communist, because there was fear, and this fear was cultivated also by the regime, not only the dictatorial regime in Greece, but also from the illiberal democracy of the 50s and 60s, which was a very strict also regime. We have also political murders. We have the people who are persecuted in the islands, they go to exile. It's not a comfortable democracy like the one we have in Metapolitevsi. So in that sense, I want to point out exactly this thing, that the most important element of this relationship between diaspora and Greece is the element of anti-communism.
Can I add something, Kostis? That dimension is particularly interesting that Thanasis is making. Going beyond the Greek-American diaspora connection, I think it's also important to bring in mind that the diaspora was particularly important in how the Metapolitevsi was developed afterwards. First of all, because there was a big number of political exiles that left during the military regime. These people were very much politically engaged, and they were pivotal in the United States, but also in many Western societies, in spreading the word that Greece is a very harsh dictatorship and needs to be brought down. But also how party politics were affected, in the sense that PASOK, a very big actor in the Metapolitevsi years and beyond, was actually born abroad, in Canada or in Sweden. Andreas Papandreou had those kinds of connections. Karamanlis as well, he came from Paris, so he had that kind of background to him. But especially PASOK was born out of diaspora politics. And that was very evident afterwards, in the years after the fall of the junta, when PASOK was the party that was much better connected with diaspora, either with the left-wingers of diaspora or with the ones that had been involved in its creation. And that's why that was also the party in the 1980s that institutionalized relations with diaspora by creating the General Secretary of Apodimos Ellinismos, and subsequently also with the SAE in the 1990s and so on. It was PASOK the party of the diaspora. Things, of course, changed afterwards, but that is also important to remember, because this is a legacy of the military regime as well.
Thank you. Let's do Tina's questions, and then Costa will go to you second. Okay, so Tina's question is on chat and says, I'm wondering if there were differences between how the junta was received in rural versus urban areas in Greece. Was the relationship different? Can you recommend any research that has been done on this? Sort of village versus rural versus urban, village versus Athens.
That is an aspect that we are not dealing in our book. So I won't be able to help much with the question. What I can say is that as it is customary in other cases of authoritarian regimes, the urban centers are the ones usually that are the ones that are much better connected with the outside world. They have a better access to news and to the different views as well. I mean, there's no coincidence that whatever demonstrations there were, they were actually happening in the big city centers of Athens or Thessaloniki. These are two more cosmopolitan centers within Greece, and big universities are there, so it is natural. Rural is definitely an environment that the military regime, and in general military regimes, will try to to attract voters, to persuade them of their righteous presence in politics. So there is definitely, and at the same time, what was happening in Greece from the 50s and 60s onwards, and it continued to happen during the military regime, there was a big wave of urbanization as well. I mean, the country was changing in the sense that there is this kind of continuity happening between the pre-junta and the junta period, how people were coming in masses from the rural areas to the big cities. And the junta period was a period as well that cities were taking shape. And the buildings were, high rises happening in most urban areas. That is, a very good question and a very important topic, I believe, that should be addressed, and which says, it tells us how many areas are still unexplored when we think of the military regime.
Thank you. Costa, yeah.
Yes, before I ask my question, I would like to add a wonderful source, the book by Apostolos Doxiadis, Epanastatis Χωρίς αιτία, which describes all the anti-junta movements inside the United States when Apostolos was at Columbia and other. I mean, Aristos Doxiadis was in Boston, and it's really very, very nicely, actually. Also, it's very captivating. But my question is the following. Compared to Spain or Portugal, which experienced like tens of 40 years or 30 years of dictatorships, what made the Greeks to develop a resistance during the junta? Because you said that indeed their daily life, their normalcy was disrupted. But as far as I remember, if you were not in a leftist family, or in a family where you had students or somebody, I think it was very hard to really actually be personally affected in your life and have, there was no real poverty or something that would motivate you to revolt. So what was different compared to Spain or Portugal, where actually even in Portugal, I think the change happened through the military, right? It was not even, there was no people's movement there.
Yeah, this is a very interesting and important comparison, this Southern European transition to democracy, because it did happen at the same time. What is also important to note is that there were three different types of transition as well. In the case of Portugal, as you rightly pointed out, it came through a military coup to the Estado Novo. It was a military coup of left-wingers who were fed up with the way colonization was, or decolonization was taking place in Portugal. In the case of Spain, it was more of an internal kind of matter, you know, sort of a kind of palace coup that, the dictatorship of Franco was replaced. And that's why there was never a rupture there. While there was a kind of a military revolution, a coup revolution, the Carnation revolution in Portugal, in the case of Spain, it was more of an agreed kind of transition. That's why, you know, the right-wing party in Spain, it did keep some of the elements of the ultra-right-wingers in Spanish politics. And the case of Greece was different in the sense that we know that there was that kind of external defeat that really brought down in one night the military regime. On the one hand, we've got two cases of long dictatorships. They started in 1930s and continued up until the 1970s. So we've got a very, very long tradition of authoritarianism there, which prescribed also the much more limited level of their relationship with Europe and their Europeanization in a way. I mean, Portugal was really isolated and much more underdeveloped even from Greece, but also Spain was more underdeveloped than Greece. Similarly, the Iberian Peninsula was isolated to a large degree, although in the 1960s, it did start to pick up, modernize and become closer to Europe. Greece always kept those kind of linkages. There was that division within the country, obviously, between left and right. So there was this polarization that we don't see in the other two countries. But at the same time, we see a better Western connection with Greece and the West. And what we also see during the late 50s and the 1960s is also closeness to Europe, going further from the United States and reaching out to the European communities as well. So, I think in Greece, things happened in much more polarized, but also in much more obvious ways. The divisions were much more obvious. The different points of views were much more obvious. Now, going into the degree of opposition, again, there is much bigger resistance in Greece than in the other two countries because of the culture of resistance from the Civil War years, but also, the polarization that was happening in politics even before. And there are also moments of resistance, but mostly I think how resistance was felt in the case of Greece was how people were exiled again, tortured, or they had to leave the country, but many also stayed silent. And the policy of the military regime was to keep consumerism and tourism, colorful tourism, and tourists to come to Greece, and also this urbanization that we spoke about, and buildings and that kind of mass consumerism in order to try and keep people happy at that level, and then forget about the illiberalism of the country. So there are differences, but it's also very important to see that all three countries, they saw the breakdown at the same time.
Thank you. It's almost 12:30. We have time for maybe one quick question. And if not, oh yes, one quick question. Yes, one final quick question.
I'd just like to add in that, you know, for the resistance and everything, the junta in Greece collapsed when they failed in the Cyprus problem. You know, that was what, because that touched everybody, you know, from what was happening. And also the junta has a lot of populist measures, especially for the farmers when they write off their, you know, whatever they were owed to the banks, things like that. So there was a kind of people that in their mind, you know, they said, oh, when we have the junta, it was that the Papandreou has not win the elections, you know, that it's the right party, you know, that is going on. That was in the beginning, but, you know, when things start going further, then people, they have realized that something different was there. And that's very important. Okay, thank you.
Okay, maybe one final quick question. Oh, I'm sorry, Othon, you wanted to respond, absolutely.
Because I think that's a very important question. The counterfactual, as we say in social sciences, if it wasn't for Cyprus, would junta have stayed longer? And I think that's, you know, it's a very important question that, you know, that we can't really give an answer, because it might be the case that obviously we know that there was resistance that came with the Polytechnic, but then we have a more repressive dictatorship replacing the previous one. We've got divisions between the military regime itself, how sustainable its continuation was. We know for sure that, you know, that defeat was really a catalyst that, you know, that brought, that was actually the event that brought the regime down. We've seen that in the case of Argentina as well, which was a similar kind of external defeat that brought the dictatorship, as opposed to Chile that stayed on and on and on. It's a combination of factors, it's not just one. There are so many, you know, conditions that really brought the breakdown. It would probably have lasted a bit longer, my guess is, if it wasn't for Cyprus in July 74. But then when it collapsed, actually, it was as if everybody was ready to create this kind of new reality.
Yeah, Mika, the last question. Yes. You are muted. You're muted. Can you unmute? There we go.
I'm sorry. Actually, I don't have a question. I lived through the dictatorship. So I have a personal feeling, a personal reaction to all of this, which is too long for me to express right now. But I would like to say a couple of things. First of all, before the dictatorship, the democracy in Greece was very weak, very sick, very troubled. So a lot of people, I remember, said, oh my God, thank God we have a dictatorship. And that lasted for a year, maybe, or two. But then the fear came down the people, fear on a personal level. Whoever thinks that the dictatorship did not touch people on a personal level, they are wrong. Because I was a high school student at the time, and I remember the fear. So that is, I don't accept that. And also I don't accept that the Polytechnic did not have a major role to this, because people realized that the resistance in their heart and their minds was larger than what they thought it was, because there was a feeling of secrecy. You were afraid of the other. You did not know who was going to be the hafies, who was going to nail you to the authorities. So you did not know who was next to you. So the Polytechnic opened the floodgates. And yes, of course, Cyprus was catalytic, but the feeling of the people that, yes, we can resist started with the Polytechnic. And not only the Polytechnic, but the law school. So there are a lot of things that when we read books, we don't have that exact feeling of the situation when you live it. And it's still too fresh for me to be too academic about this. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, let me say something. I've got similar memories of the military regime, actually, and I do remember the Polytechnic uprising. I was in my school years, and I do know exactly the sense of fear that you're talking about. It is something which preoccupies many people when they live under dictatorships. I've been involved a lot with people that have suffered from Erdogan's, recent undemocratic abuses, in the sense that many of them come to Oxford because they have to leave the country. They are not free to speak, and it's so it's so painful to see how these people actually self-censor themselves because they're afraid of themselves. Or they're afraid of what it might happen to their families. Even if you go abroad into exile, you're still worried that if you open your mouth and say something, your family is going to bear the consequences. So that feeling of fear is what the military rulers actually and the dictators know. This is what is the environment that they create in order for people to self-censor themselves, basically. And that is the most typical characteristic of a dictatorship. And that's what happened also in the 7 years, absolutely. There were those who were passive and they were not so, possibly they didn't allow themselves to be so much affected, but there was a very, very big part of the population that was afraid. And as you very rightly say, the Polytechnic uprising was that moment really that made people think that yes, there can be this kind of forceful resistance, and it can be open, and it leads the way to to liberation. It's just that my hypothesis was, when would have been the ending of the dictatorship? The July moment was very important to to bring it about. But still, the junta had delegitimized themselves in many ways.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add that it was we didn't speak openly, but it was an undercurrent in people talking about the huge scandals, the corruption of the dictatorship. Remember the tama, the money they were collecting for the tama, or the rotten meats. People we knew what was happening. We knew that in the area of Plaka and Tisio, engineers were burying antiquities in the foundations of buildings that mushroomed like this because the dictatorship was looking the other way. We knew all these things. You can't contain the feelings and the resistance inside the people. So it was bound to happen. And I do believe that the Polytechnic was the compressor that started breaking the foundations. And of course, whatever. I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying that there are some things that we need to more forcefully explain to people what happened and how it felt, rather than historic events one after the other.
Yeah, I think the discipline of history is very important in this sense, because there are social historians now that are actually looking at this kind of perspectives. I would recommend my friend and colleague Kostis Kornetis, because he's written about those pockets of resistance during the military.
I have read
how the theater, to Megalo Mastirko, became a symbol of resistance. Listening to Theodorakis' music. I mean, there are so many kind of examples that one can actually remember.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. A very painful subject for me.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you everyone for coming on a beautiful morning here in Philadelphia, and a beautiful afternoon or early morning in other parts of the world. This was absolutely wonderful, and I want to thank our speakers for this amazing presentation and an overview that got us really talking and thinking. So thank you everyone. So
thank you.
Thank you.
yes. All right, so have a good afternoon, everybody. So we'll see you in our next talk. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.